Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of the Italeri 1/72nd scale Ju87 G-2 build. In a previous video I've covered building this kit, so go check that one out if you haven't. In today's video we'll be focusing on the painting. I decided to do the winter scheme included in this kit, largely because it was the one featured on the box art, which in my opinion looked really awesome in a really old school Airfix kind of way. I also had one of my loyal viewers request it, and on top of that, it was a bit of a challenge and something I haven't done. So with my mind made up, it was time to give it a go. Since the white would have been applied over the top of both the markings and the two-tone camouflage, for this video we'll just be covering painting the aircraft and doing the decals. And in part 3, where I'll also cover the weathering techniques I use, we'll apply the winter wash coat. Starting off as always with the lightest colour when it comes to painting, I begin with some AK Interactive RLM65 light blue for the underside of the aircraft. I use a relatively wide brush to help reduce the amount of brush strokes and pretty much pour it straight out of the bottle onto a little bit of cardboard to use as a palette. For the most part, the AK Interactive paints tend to be pretty well mixed from the start, so I find I don't have to add too much water to help thin them down. I applied the paint using my normal technique of going from the front of the aircraft to the rear, or as I like to describe, in the direction air would flow over the aircraft. The most important thing when it comes to hand painting aircraft with a brush is to make sure that your layers are very nice and thin, and that you do several layers rather than one, which helps to reduce visible brush strokes and means that the surface details of the aircraft will be a lot less hidden by paint. I ended up doing 3 layers of the RLM65 before turning my attention to the upper surface of the aircraft. Before painting the two-tone green on the upper surface, I paint the canopy of the aircraft very carefully using a fine brush and some XF24 dark grey. If you make a mess while painting them, don't stress too much, because acrylic paints, while they're still drying, can be relatively easily scratched off. I decided however to wait until after I'd painted the green to neaten up any of the mistakes I'd made. For the upper surface, the lightest colour which I start off painting with is RLM71, which is the standard sort of lighter green that was used by German aircraft during the early parts of World War II, and for the bombers pretty much throughout the entire war. I used the same technique I applied with the RLM65 on the upper surface, using the darker colour and taking care to avoid overbrushing the areas where the RLM65 was on the undersurface. As you can see, the RLM71 illustrates a lot more clearly just how thin the paint should be when you apply it, as when you apply the first coat you should still be able to see the light grey of the plastic on the underside of the paint. As you build up layers, this will gradually fade away until you have a nice solid base that's not too thick and still shows all your details. While the first coat of RLM71 dries, I use a cocktail stick to carefully remove the excess XF24 that I don't want on some of the clear sections of the canopy. Once this is done, I then apply a second coat of RLM71 and finally a third coat before then starting to apply the camouflage pattern. For the second shade of green, I use RLM70, which I thin with a little bit of water, and then I use a slightly finer brush than I've used previously to first create the shape of the camouflage pattern, and then gradually fill the areas in. I try to do them in as few strokes as possible to help keep them nice and straight, because the German aircraft camouflage tends to be very angular and sharp-edged. As much as possible, I'll also apply the paint in the same direction as I've done with the previous layers to reduce the brush strokes, although sometimes at a slight angle to help line up with the camouflage markings. I'm not too stressed about getting the pattern perfect, especially on the first few coats, since I'll later go over with a little bit more paint to neaten up any mistakes, but for the most part I basically just follow the instructions for the marking guide and use panel lines to help line up the areas where the markings are. Since I have it out, I use the RLM70 to also paint the canopy frames, which would have predominantly been the darker colour. I use a finer brush however than I've done with the fuselage to do so. After the first coat of RLM70 is dry, I then go over it again in pretty much the exact same fashion with another coat of RLM70 to help make the coat a little bit more uniform and the paint a little bit darker. I also make sure to neaten up any mistakes I've made as I go and add extra areas of RLM70 that I might have missed in the first pass. I also use RLM70 to paint some of the accessories that I've left on the sprue so I wouldn't break them off while painting the rest of the aircraft, and I remove the excess RLM70 from the canopy frame after the second coat has dried using a cocktail stick to help neaten it up. I applied a fourth and final coat of RLM65 on the undersurface, using it as an opportunity to help neaten up any mistakes and make sure I had the correct amount of RLM65 on the sides of the fuselage, and then I applied another layer of RLM71 on the upper surface, which would also be a fourth and final layer. I used a finer brush this time, however, and applied it in a more similar fashion to I did with the RLM70, because I was making sure that the camouflage pattern was correct and neatening up any excess RLM70 and mistakes I'd made along the way. Once the RLM71 had dried, I then applied a third and final coat of RLM70 in the exact same fashion to neaten up mistakes, and then I was ready to paint some of the finer details onto the model. For the distinct yellow eastern front bands on the underside of the wings and the fuselage sides, I used Vallejo flat yellow rather than the included decals, as I wanted to achieve a bit of a softer marking result. However, I struggled a little bit with the yellow, as it seemed that every time I applied it, it would strip a little bit of itself away on the undersurface. In the end, it took about 4 coats. This was possibly due to some rather nasty weather, which was very humid and wet, which made the paint take a lot longer to dry, which meant that as I was repainting it, even though it looked a bit dry, it was still a little bit wet. I didn't have as much of an issue with the Vallejo flat white, however, which was painted onto the spinner and only required 3 coats, despite the RLM70 it was painted on being quite dark. I used Vallejo flat black on the tyres for the aircraft, and then continued to apply coats of white and yellow until I was happy with their result. As a result of the large numbers of layers and the paint's inconsistency, I had to neaten up quite a fair bit of the mistakes. So I ended up getting out a little bit more of the RLM70 and neatening up the band on the fuselage, the propeller blades, and also the leading edge of the wing, which I needed to also remove a bit of the blue from. I then touched up around the propeller and got out some RLM71 and did the same technique to neaten up the bands, before then using RLM65 on the underside to neaten up the bands on both the wings and also the fuselage. The wheel hubs also received a slight touch-up of RLM65 before receiving a third and final coat of flat black on the tyres themselves. And with that done, the last thing to do was to paint the khaki drab onto the coverings for the landing gear, and to paint the cannon barrels flat aluminium before it was time to apply the decals. Much like the Vallejo paints didn't like the wet weather we had for a full week here, the decals also suffered a fair bit, especially when I dropped the box that I was carrying them in a puddle of water while travelling from work to home. Fortunately, the decals needed for the scheme and some of the common decals which were important were still intact. The only thing I had to replace was a spare Balkenkreuz which I had lying around, so fortunately it wasn't too much of a setback at all. I cut out the decals I want and then use a pair of tweezers to stick them in a little bit of water for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then I slid them off the transfer paper using a brush. The Italeri decals for this kit seemed to be very prone to bending. They were very difficult to apply unless I pretty much had them slid straight off the transfer paper, when with a lot of other decals they usually managed to hold their shape while travelling between them. Fortunately though, none of them managed to tear or break, so they seem to be of decent quality, albeit a little bit wanting to curl up and shrivel. Once I'd won the battle of applying all the decals, I then got out a brush and some Vallejo decal softener and applied it onto all of the decals to help soften them so that they would be a little bit more malleable and prone to showing through the surface details. I then apply a bit of decal adhesive over the top to help them conform better to the model and make sure they stay down. I finally dabbed a little bit of paper towel to remove the excess decal products and water from the decals, and then left them to dry for 24 hours. For the distinct German spinner, I decided against using the decal and instead decided to carefully hand paint it using a little bit of Vallejo flat black and a very fine brush. I just find that the decals are very difficult to line up straight, and it's a little bit easier to paint it and then neaten up any mistakes you make later on with a bit of white rather than using the decal. And with that, the model was ready for a bit of weathering and its winter wash coat, which is what we'll be doing in the next video. So, thank you very much for having a watch of this one. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also feel free to leave any quips or suggestions you have in the comments section below. Big shout out as always to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying and doing these videos, and to everyone for watching and subscribing to the channel. Anyways, take care, and until the next video, model on!